My name is Warwick, and I'm the head of economic and social policy at Policy Exchange, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here to this event looking at public libraries and asking the question, can community-run libraries succeed? We have got a very interesting panel that brings together a range of expertise, practice and experience in this area, and I'm going to work sort of this way backwards. Colin Noble is the leader of Suffolk County Council. For many years he was their cabinet member for finance, and I know this from having been the cabinet member for finance in the London Borough, Kensington and Chelsea in roughly the same period. It's been a very difficult challenge of adjustment and change for all local authorities, and he will have actually borne the brunt of that as the cabinet member for finance, and I know that Suffolk has done some very interesting things, and it will be worthwhile hearing that from them. Vidyha Alakeson, the chief executive of Power to Change, the organisation that is supporting us, brings a huge expertise and experience from both the private sector and from the public service, from the Treasury, from the National Health Service, but very importantly, an American perspective. And I think that often in Canada and North America and in, say, New York State, sometimes having a perspective of, say, what the public library in New York is like is very, very helpful, or indeed a public library in Williamsville, just outside of Buffalo. It does actually help you reflect on the services we offer here. And I'm delighted also that Glen, who's a very old friend of mine, and actually the Minister for Libraries, so we really have, we've got the business here today, has very kindly come along to help us as well. Policy Exchange takes the role of libraries in the wider social life of the community very seriously, and we take libraries very seriously in what I would call the important issues to do with the definition and transmission of culture. So, without any further ado, I thought I would actually ask Vidyha to actually set the scene about public services in general and where libraries fit within that. And I don't think we should be shy of talking about the challenges of public services in general and libraries, because every area of the public service, whether it's health, long-term care, spending on science, education, or libraries, has to face the challenge of examination of its opportunity cost and its place within spending priorities.
Great. Thanks, Warwick. It's great to be here. Just a brief word about Power to Change before I talk more specifically about the role of communities in running libraries. So Power to Change was set up in 2015, and we have a specific mission to stimulate the growth of community-led businesses across England. As part of that, we've supported a number of community libraries, and I'll draw on some of that experience in what I say over the next 5 minutes or so. I think if we'd met several years ago, this discussion might have focused on whether communities should run library services. I think now, in the face of what's happened to local authority finances, it's part of the reality that we're living with. The latest DCMS estimate is that there are at least 400 community libraries. That's 13% of libraries across the UK. So since 2010, 343 libraries have been closed and 174 have been transferred to the community. And we're seeing this in areas as diverse as Sheffield and Gateshead, down to Dorset, Buckinghamshire, Warwickshire, Gloucestershire. And the financial picture facing local authorities going forward means that more will be transferred, and we know that several local authorities are thinking about transfers at a significant scale. And there are also other interesting alternative models around public sector mutuals which are emerging, and I know Colin from Suffolk will probably talk about some of that, because Suffolk's been one of the leaders in that, along with Devon and other counties. And some of these have got significant community alongside public sector employee involvement. And I think as the experience of communities running libraries has grown, the reality has allayed some of the initial fears that this would mean a significant degradation of library services. In fact, the latest research indicates that community libraries provide most of the same services that the statutory provision was offering, and there's good evidence that they actually go beyond that to provide additional services to the local community and to bring in a significant amount of innovation in terms of the business models that can actually support the long-term viability of library services. So I think the important question at this juncture is not whether the communities can run these successfully, but how we might support them to run them more successfully in more places, and to give local authorities the confidence to make transfers of library services to communities. So first and foremost, as we find across the whole community-led business space, success for community-led libraries is very much dependent on engagement and support from local authorities. This has got to be about a partnership between the community, the local authority, and professional librarians, rather than, I think, as was previously often portrayed, one against the other. This is very much about a partnership approach. In some cases, the support is financial that local authorities are able to offer. So, for example, in Gateshead, the local authority transferred all of its large percentage of its libraries over to local communities, but did that on a sliding scale of financial support. So over 3 years, they put in some financial support, which gradually withdrew as the community was then able to develop its own business model to keep that going. But it doesn't just have to be financial. We know that the transfer of the library asset itself can be critical. So a lot of communities find that they have to create a much more diverse business model to support the core library service. And 60% of them rely on space, hiring out space in order to make that business model stack up. So the transfer of an asset can be a really powerful way in which they can continue to support that library service. So just to give you an example, Melton Cllr, which is a small village outside Huddersfield, took over its library service from the local authority. It's integrated that service into a much wider community hub, which generates revenue through the renting out of space to the community, but also through a business centre where it rents out space to small businesses, local entrepreneurs, and all of that, those different income streams together are sustaining what was the library service that the local authority could no longer afford to sustain. And there are lots of other ways in which local authorities can enable communities. They can provide training, access to professional librarians, access to resources, wider kind of capacity building to ensure community organisations can really take this on. So there's some very practical ways that we can really make a success of community libraries. But there's another more important dimension, I think, that's worth dwelling on, and that's really giving community groups the freedom to do things differently. With the freedom to do things differently from the way the statutory service would be run, communities can be more responsive to the needs of local people. They can provide alternative services, a much wider array of services, and they can draw new people in. For example, we know that the working age population doesn't really use libraries as much as those who are out of work or older. Lots of community libraries are opening in the evenings. They're having events and different kinds of discussions in the evenings that are drawing in new populations that wouldn't otherwise be using those facilities. But they've got to be allowed to have that freedom to do things differently while still protecting the original service. And we know, although it's a small sample, we know that libraries that are run by the community sort of independently of the local authority, therefore with that freedom to really act differently, have greater income generation possibilities. So that flexibility that they're afforded makes it easier for them to go on and generate additional revenue. And I think the Conservatives have always had a proud tradition of supporting entrepreneurialism in all its forms, and I think there's a real opportunity through libraries and other forms of public services to support the entrepreneurialism of communities. And I just want to finish really by talking about what the success, I think, of community libraries might mean for other areas of public service. I think overall there are lots of opportunities, particularly in those areas of public services where relationships and local knowledge really matter more than technical skills and knowledge, for communities to play a real role in delivering public services. And I'll just give you one example, so I don't want to overrun, and that's of New Wortley, which is a community-run and owned centre up in Leeds. It's on an estate in Leeds. They've been running an offender rehabilitation service, and their success rates are far outstripping the average reoffending rates in West Yorkshire. So of the 80 people they've supported, only 2 have reoffended, compared to a 34% reoffending rate in the rest of West Yorkshire. And what is it about what they're doing that's different? The first is that the service is run by a local person from the same community who's an ex-offender himself. So it's a much different experience for those who are part of the service. They're being supported by somebody who's from their community. And it's also being run out of this community-owned centre where local people feel comfortable, it's destigmatised, it's not judgmental, it's not a service so much as a local asset that people feel comfortable in. And that combination of a local person with the lived experience that the ex-offenders are going through, together with that locally rooted service, is really making a difference to the outcomes. So I think where libraries have shown the way, other areas such as particularly adult social care, offender rehabilitation, really there's huge possibilities for communities to get more engaged and for us to really exploit that local knowledge, that deep local rootedness to get better outcomes out of public services. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Colin, are you going to give us some guidance on what you've done in Suffolk?
Yep, with pleasure. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So Suffolk and where we're at today, and I'm going to touch on three things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think goes well now, and then a little bit, as you were saying, about the future and some of the things as we see it as a county council. So in 2010, Conservative government went into coalition and we had the comprehensive spending review, and I suppose in local government we knew that there were going to have to be significant cuts, savings, call them what you will. And so we started to look at everything we do, and one of the services we delivered obviously is libraries. And at the time we had a very gun-ho chief executive, and she wanted to tell the world how things were going to change, and we had something called the New Strategic Direction, and she used things like burning oil rig platforms, and she generally scared everybody to death, frankly. And one of the notions was that as the Minister no doubt will say, there is a statutory duty to provide library services, and we worked out that we could do that with 7. So we could close 44 of our libraries and retain 7. Well, that didn't go down so well, to be perfectly honest, and in my home village there is a small library, and it had something like 400 registered users, and it had about 200 people, adults and children, who used it on a regular basis. Well, the petition against me got 1,000 signatures in a village of 4,000 people. So I thought, well, I've got to do something about this. So I hired the village hall and called a public meeting. It's one of the ways we do these things to try and lance some of it. And there were 130 people turned up, and they were principally there whether to tie me to a tree and set me to fire or just hang me from the nearest tree. And I said to them, you know what? When I started out, the first thing I was ever allowed to do in this village was walk to the village hall, because the library used to be in a side room in the village hall. And that was the first thing I was allowed to do as a child. So I was reminding my community I was one of them, and I lived in the village, which I think was important. And we went through this process, and I think very quickly we realised that actually we've got a real problem here. You've got a library service that isn't overtly used. It's costing a great deal of money, £6 million. We need to take some money out of it. And the second we talk about closure or anything else, quite frankly, everybody starts writing in how important the library is. They don't use them, but they are incredibly important. And that's a real problem in local politics. If everybody wants you to preserve something but nobody actually uses the service, that's a real problem that you have. So we looked at it, and at the time I was looking at lots of different things. And one of the things we said, well, we need to involve the community more. We were a very traditional library service. There were librarians. It was all a little bit hushed. And actually, we need to think about how we do this differently. So what we said to every single library, and there were a variety of friends groups and libraries that had no friends groups and a whole range. We said to the libraries, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to give you the libraries. So we created a mutual. And the mutual is owned by friends groups from each of the libraries, and they vary from a group of volunteers who simply come together. In my village they're called Folk, Friends of Lake and Heath Library. They've got a little blog site, isn't very active, but they do arrange things, and when the village has a carnival they have a tent, and they put the library in the tent when we have the fete, and actually the usage has gone up, and we have seen that across Suffolk. So today there are 44 libraries, there are 4 vans that go round, and there always was. But we've taken a third of the cost out. So we have taken £2 million out of the service. And yet, there is just as many libraries, and in reality, they're opening a little bit more. So across Suffolk, something like 3 million interactions. Nationally, over the past few years, it's gone down about 6%, I think, nationally. Suffolk's is stable. There's the same number of people using the library. So I take that as being a measure of success. We have retained the infrastructure, so we've retained the computer systems, we've retained the buildings, we've retained the vans, and we contract an independent industrial society, which is how they formed, to actually deliver the service. And this year, we've retendered with them. We've taken some more money out, but we've agreed a 5-year deal. So we've actually said, okay, here's your money for 5 years, and the interesting thing we're doing is we're giving them the 5-year money now. So they're getting all the money to run their service, and they can invest in their service. So that's the sort of journey we went on. So I'd like to say it was an intellectual piece about how we were going to do things, and we would take it forward. It was frankly more a reaction to the level of resistance we were meeting. But I think it's something that a lot of councils have looked at and are heading down. So what about the future? I think there's an issue about the future, and you were alluding to some of it. Certainly from my county council point of view, we don't have many touchdown points. We don't have many retail. There are very few places you'll see our sign anymore. Most of the services we deliver are to people who are vulnerable, so we don't tend to have a big van saying Suffolk County Council helping a vulnerable person at this address. It's all very discreet. So the only real retail points we have are the libraries. And so we're now talking to them about how we extend the services that we offer. We're talking about our children's centre offer, we're talking about our family hub offer, and we're talking about the advice and services that we can provide through our 44 touchdown points. And I think this is the future. I think it's not just about the traditional library services. For a lot of counties, it's the one place in most communities where we exist, and we want to see it as much more a point where people, when they need information, and they don't want to do it online because there is a dreadful default in this country of everything being online, then there is somewhere to go, and there will be somebody there who understands what it is you're talking about, is trained, and is able to direct you to the information you want. And certainly from our county point of view, that is absolutely how we see the future of the library service.
Colin, thank you very much indeed. Glen, you see it... John, I'm so sorry. Yes, you see it absolutely top down from a very broad perspective, and I think it will be very interesting to hear your perspective.
Sure, thank you very much, Warwick, and it's great to have the opportunity to be here and to reflect on this. I've been the Minister for 4 months. I've visited several libraries already, but I'm privileged to represent Salisbury, and so I also have the perspective on libraries from my engagement there over the last 7 years. And as the other speakers have said, libraries are a key part of our community. People are very, very sensitive about changes to their library. They're very anxious when they feel that they're under threat. And across the country we have 3,036 libraries, 211 million visits last year, and 177 million book issues. But it might also interest you to know that last year we had 42,000 volunteers. And 42,000 volunteers in our libraries, I think, is the first key issue that we've seen in the changes in the way that library services have been delivered. As Colin has set out, I think somewhat diplomatically, there have been real challenges. I spent 3 years as PPS to the local government secretary, Eric Pickles, and I saw up close some of the challenges to funding for local government. But I'm optimistic about libraries, because when I go to libraries, and I've been to the one here on Saturday in Manchester, I've been to the one in Liverpool, I've been to several in Wiltshire and in other places, British Library, I see a transformation happening. A transformation in the role and the vision that local authorities and local communities have for their libraries. Because we are beginning to now engage with what the functions of a library need to be in the world that we live in today. Now, I certainly remember going to the library in Chippenham in North Wiltshire, where I grew up, every week to get my book and then to take it back and make sure it had been read. That's not how most people use libraries now. They go there for a whole range of services. And it seems to me we either embrace that and work out how to get the right model, be it a community trust, be it friends of model, be it swiping your card and no staff member, or actually having a more traditional model with other services around it. And there won't be one size fitting all. Now, I am the Libraries Minister, but I have to be absolutely clear. Local authorities are responsible for providing the statutory service. There's a task force from the LGA, which I involve myself in a great deal. And what I'm about trying to do is to try and ensure that best practices and the best models are fully extended and rolled out. And it seems to me that libraries are becoming cultural hubs in different communities. I'm a Minister for Arts, Heritage and Tourism, and in many of the libraries that I've been to, it's become a venue for arts activities, for cultural activities, often with a gallery nearby. And it's the centre for artistic communities in rural and urban areas. And I think that's really important because there are therefore income-generating activities that come from that. And I think that's absolutely desirable. Variation in opening hours is also another factor that will need to be considered. It may be that in some areas, in university towns, it is desirable to have more hours open, but in other parts of the community, other communities across the country, actually you will not need to have the same hours opening because you actually know from clear data that actually people don't use it at certain times. And so we need to just embrace this rather than actually say, well, it's a tragedy for our community if a library's model changes. That seems to me ridiculous. Other areas that I've been interested in seeing the expansion of, pioneered really by the British Library, we've seen business support services. We've got a network now of 12 of those across the country, and I hope that we'll see an extension of that. Entrepreneurial activity that people need some support. They don't necessarily think they're going to go to a formal business support organisation, but they will go to their library, and as an extension of researching or looking into something, they will then be able to get some advice. These are the sorts of services that we need to see be delivered. So we have the task force, we have a small amount of money, the Library Innovation Funds, and we have a toolkit to try and extend the range of solutions really across the country. There are a number of good examples across the country, but what I find is that when you actually look into it, there's no real reason why libraries need to shut if you've got the right leadership and the right model for the future. Because the public enthusiasm, when converted into volunteers, actually means you can fill the gap that the public funding that once was there is no longer as readily available, can be substituted for. So I am very optimistic about community-run libraries. They are working. I think more of them will exist and they will work better as we begin to learn the lessons across the estate, as it were. And of course, I will do everything I can to maximise investment in libraries, but it is sometimes about capital investment to create revenue streams to do things differently and better. And if you go to the best of the new examples of libraries out there today, I think you'll be very surprised by the quality of the services and the range of services that exist, and you'll be very glad that there has been an innovation in the service delivery in the recent years.
John, thank you very much indeed for that. I think of all cities where one can actually have a discussion about libraries and their future, Manchester is a very special place to actually conduct that discussion. Manchester is unusual in that it actually has a thriving private library. There's the Portico Library, which is just down the road from this building. You can go in there, you can have lunch in there, as I've just had. It's a subscription library, and it's certainly, in terms of the journals available in there, actually rather better than is currently available in the principal central reference library in terms of what I saw available this morning. And I think that the idea that all libraries will be funded by the state in the future and people like me will get what I want out of them may have to be modified, and we may have to think of ways in which we can look again at some private contribution along the lines of the remaining proprietary libraries and so on. The other interesting thing about Manchester, it has one of the great academic specialist historic libraries, the John Rylands Library. Now, in the United States, there are a number of these libraries. There's the Morgan Library, there's the Huntington Library. There are very few of them in Britain. It's very interesting that there's one in Manchester as well. And, of course, the Central Reference Library, that has been completely made over since the last time I was in Manchester, is an absolutely splendid city hub library, and it's going gangbusters in there at the moment. There's food, there's all the things you actually would like in a modern library. But I'm going to enter one caveat. I'm not certain that the full range of reference materials that you would like to think will be at the heart of Liverpool or Plymouth or Birmingham or Manchester really are there. And indeed, the librarians at the Portico Library explained to me that some 300,000 books were removed in the changeover to the new arrangements. In Norwich, which is a benchmark library, there was a fire. It had to be rebuilt. They've got all the modern services there, and it's very impressive when you go there, but the librarians will explain to you that the range of reference materials and books that you have access to have diminished by a third. The other big problem I think there is that when I was much younger, you could drift into a university library and use it. They were very open about it. Quite often these days they will not let you in. You will have to pay a ticket of maybe £30, maybe £50 or more to go into a first-class academic reference library, and it's jolly pricey. In addition, even those like Plymouth University Library will let you in, but they haven't got anything they're really worth using unless you can go onto their online reference materials, and then you come up against the complex issues to do with licenses, and unless you're a member of the university, you can't access it. So although that is a community university library, the community in practice can't do it. Now I know the Minister is well seized of this and is very interested in this. So I think we do have interesting challenges going ahead, and one of the things that I feel that we have got to have a mind on is that the borrowing the book, I think, is actually going to diminish and come to an end. But there's going to be stuff in there that none of us on this panel would like to have access to, but we can't go and buy for ourselves. Like, I can't afford to buy Nature or Foreign Affairs or something like that. Some of them you can get online, but many of them come up to that barrier and says $12 or 15 quid or £200 as a subscription. And it's okay if you've got a gold American Express card to help you out, but if you haven't, it's actually not quite so good. Now, I'm sure you have all sorts of interventions, questions, and tell us that we've got it all totally wrong, and we'd love to actually hear from you. So, away you go. Gentleman there.
My name is Will Malcolm, I work for Core Cities UK. I'm interested in community-run libraries, and as a group we believe in local solutions. What I'm interested in is how do you build up the community capacity to enable people to take on libraries? Because the title of this is Can Community-Run Libraries Succeed? You could argue it depends on the community. So it depends how engaged people are, it depends what levels of deprivation they have sometimes. And in the cities that we represent, in some areas of our inner cities, it's increasingly more difficult to get people actually involved in running services.
They did that.
Yeah. Just to explain one thing about your comment about reference works. I've worked with Bournemouth and Port Libraries, but with reference departments for a long time. The reason why we don't have those reference books anymore is because they don't exist, because the information has now gone online.
Exactly. Yes.
And we were finding that they actually weren't being used, so we don't use them anymore. We actually offer information in a completely different way. And even when it comes to journals and magazines, they themselves, we have a subscription to Vidyha. You can actually view those journals online. So libraries have gone with where the world is going, which is offering online services. So that's the reason why.
Although I have to tell you, in my own local authority, when the librarians assured me of that, and I wanted Foreign Affairs, I wanted Nature, and I had a whole list of things we put to the test with the Chief Librarian and the Deputy Chief Executive, it was very embarrassing because Mummy's my American Express card was needed.
Yeah, well, if you work with Vidyha and Nature is on there, but
Yeah.
may I just have
Well, they are, of course, common goods, but you go through a whole list of journals, and you will actually find that the invitation is after the third paragraph to start paying.
And I do have just one question for Colin Noble. With your using volunteers, your community-run libraries, could you just tell me the main strength of those libraries, or one main weakness of those libraries, and how many volunteers you have for a library, say the size of Woodbridge, just an average size of how many volunteers are needed, and whether there's a full-time person, or how does it actually work?
And shall we have a third one? Gentleman there.
Yeah, Mike Tannen from Reading East. I welcome John to his position as life minister with a somewhat heavy heart because I'm the Alakeson agent for Lord Wilson.
Great man.
Was one of the many good MPs who unfortunately lost his seat in June. As a former councillor, I understand also the professional accounts
Well, I'm going to ask the panel to comment on everything or pick what they want to do. If we start with Colin, work across.
So, well, this point about core cities, I think, and the thing about community capacity, I think is really fascinating. I mean, I think fundamentally, for me, that's the bit that interests me with the libraries. With all due respect to everybody else, the academic bit, I'm just not that into. The bit I'm into is the social bit. It is around how do you build capacity within communities. What I do know is I know of the £500 million a year I spend, we're doing something called the Suffolk Blueprint at the moment. We're looking at public health, we're looking at the engagement of people, and we're saying, what's this place going to look like in 20 years' time if we do nothing? And basically in 20 years' time, we're out of money, and generally speaking, there are real problems within the systems of health and public health and various other things. So for me, it's absolutely about how do you get communities engaged, how do you find activities. So actually getting involved in libraries is quite transactional for a lot of people, because you go into the building, you do something, you do the books, or you sort of get involved. You might even do the cleaning, whatever it happens to be. But the point is that I think the fundamental role of councils moving forward is less about direct service delivery and more about how do you engage and get communities to do it for themselves, because quite frankly we ain't got the money to do it for them. So I think there's a really interesting point there. It is about people on the ground. It is about what we call locality officers. It is about people who know their patch. They get called a wide and huge range of different things, but actually people in the community who know where the connections are, they know the people, they know how to get involved. And, you know, get involved sometimes is really sophisticated. It's like putting a notice up on a parish notice board. I mean, it's like, it's at that level often to get engaged with people, and then getting people to come along, get involved. And I'll tell you what, the fundamental thing that got people involved and why every single library got itself an active friends, because basically we threatened them. And we said we were going to close them, and you'd be amazed. And what we actually said to people was, well, if you don't like it, then may I politely suggest you do something about it? And instead of writing very eloquent letters to me, why don't you get involved in your local library? And a lot of it came from that. It came from the threat aspect of it. Now, that's not a particularly long-term thing for a politician, to be honest, to go around threatening communities. But it does actually, if you say to people, we are exiting this space, what are you going to do about it? Actually, you will often engage with people. This point about Woodbridge, I don't know. It's one of the bigger libraries. I'm absolutely not. We do have a backbone of professional library staff, so they are there. But their job, again, 10 years ago, it was to run a library. Now, it's to run a community facility. And their skill sets are different. And we had people leave. We had people who wanted to be pure librarians, and they wanted the academia of it. But they're not the people who are running, the professionals who are running the library. The professionals who are running the library are more about being community activists.
No idea how many volunteers overall then you have in all the libraries?
Across the entire 44 libraries, on average, so if you said sort of average libraries, so in that 44 there are about 20 there are about 5 bigs, about another 15 medium, and then the rest are quite small. The small ones, on average, about 15 people will be involved, and they get bigger and they get slightly more professional. And then the number of actual professional librarians goes up as well. So.
Thanks. Yeah, so picking up the point that you raised about does this work in deprived areas? I think from our experience, what we see is there is more need for local authority support and capacity building in more deprived areas. So some of the models that we've seen where local authorities have done a tail down in the support that they've been able to offer, those seem like the models that are going to work most successfully. But there are really good examples. I was reading about one in Doncaster of a community-run library in one of the most deprived wards in England. So there are lots of good examples where deprived communities do take this on, but I think if we want this to be an opportunity that's open to the whole range of communities, not just the more affluent ones with high social capital, then we are going to need more support. I mean, the point about the professional librarians, I don't have the stats to hand, but just to say that there are multiple different models, and community-run libraries are not one thing by any means. There are lots of different models and mixes of volunteers and professional staff operating. And I think one of the things, given that the minister's sitting next to me, is it would be really good to have a richer database of what is going on in community libraries. They're all there are lots of different models, there are lots of different revenue streams. Actually, our understanding is quite patchy of what's really working and what's not working.
Okay. I think I would echo the comments just made about the range of experiences, but I don't start from the view that core cities are poorer communities, therefore they're less willing to, because I think if we start off with that presumption, I think it's quite patronising and wrong. So I think that it's about saying what is the actual offer that is appropriate for this community. And when I've been to places where they've got some children's work going on, if you just look around the corner at what they've done with the children's library area here to bring in people that won't be able to access the internet and other services, it's been fantastic. There are collaborations with DWP, there are collaborations with public health, all of those things drawing people in. But I do think that, Colin's right, that when you say that, look, there's a pressure here, we need people to step forward, you will find in most communities a core of people will come forward. But the point you make is a reasonable one. We've got to make sure that we get the right model to evolve, and we get the right levels of support and the right collaboration. You won't have a highly supported arts trust in every area that's prepared to rent space in a library. So I accept that. I agree with your comments about my predecessor, and I met him a number of times and I'm trying to take on forward some of the things that he's done. On the philanthropic point, of course, many libraries were historically founded by people that actually did make a lot of money, and actually my view is there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, what you're going to put back is the first question that you should be asking when you make money. And anything we can do to encourage philanthropy in this area, particularly given the broader challenges that we face, it will never substitute the ownership and local ownership and community-led solutions. But in some cases where people have that vision to give, then that's welcome and can be channeled in the right way. And I don't think we need to see it as a new thing. It's part of our sort of history in this area.
I've got 3 questions already. Lady there, then the gentleman, then the gentleman back.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, Elena Woodstone from Salisbury. Although English is my 3rd language, I'm quite passionate about English literature, and for 5 years I support Royal Society of Literature, being their patron. So I have 2 pieces of background information for you before I ask a question, which is also a suggestion. So one is at a national level. You may already know that just 2 months ago, Royal Society of Literature published this report, which is Literature in Britain Today. And one of the foundings there, it was a survey by 2,000 people.
We will need a question.
Yes, and all of them, they said what they want, what people want. They want cheaper books, they want recommendations to read, what to read, and they want more local libraries. So have you been explored actually this sort of combination, that actually library can be a source of information what to read, and maybe some authors with more affordable books can be there, and to bring this additional value to people. Yep. So what about other ways of efficient running of the library? That's my main question.
That's lovely. Thank you very much indeed. The gentleman directly behind.
Thank you. My name is Mohan Iyengar. I'm from Poole in Dorset. I'm councillor responsible for...
All's very well represented here today, isn't it?
I'm responsible for libraries. So we've just joined together with Bournemouth, so we've got 22 libraries as a first step. But the second step, and the most important one, is the operating model going forward. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I think my question is a kind of simple one. I'm listening very keenly about the example from Colin, the model, to use going forward. How we need to proceed at pace, but I am absolutely passionate about keeping the library service in its broadest form. I grew up in libraries. What's the best way for someone like me to keep in touch with good practices and ideas about how different models have been tested and applied around the country, please? So that literally we can go at pace, but literally we can be mindful of the best practices that are being tried and are being used.
And there's a gentleman right at the back.
Thank you. I'm from Darlington, where I'm sure the Minister is aware at the moment the Council's plans to close down a philanthropically founded 19th century library and move it into the swimming baths. is being challenged by a judicial review. But be that as it may, it means it's a very live issue in what's a comparatively small borough. I'd like to ask, this is a genuine question, not a loaded statement, is taking on positions of responsibility in a community, particularly involving public cash, is an onerous one, and to get people to do it, they have to be brave and be risk takers, but they tend to be older with more time to do it and so on. I mean, is the national experience that success depends on particular kinds of people in particular circumstances? I would have thought that in most voluntary organised groups and bodies, it usually has leaders. So what if there aren't any?
Lovely. Shall we?
Yes, sure. So thank you very much for the reference to the Royal Society of Literature. I'm very happy to meet with them and to look into more detail into what they have to say. I think there is a role for libraries and librarians to collaborate with local schools in terms of actually setting out reading patterns and reading advice. And I think that those sorts of collaborations need to happen, and it rather reinforces the centrality of libraries in different communities. I think in terms of how I can support, how we can give you the best information, Sarah, about your need to know best practices is if we exchange details afterwards, I will write to you and set it all out. But the task force, if you Google it, you can find out quite a lot from that. But I will write to you with a sort of special letter which sets out all the opportunities and things that are going on. With respect to the Darlington matter, I won't comment on that because it's an ongoing challenge. To some extent, I agree with you that there is an issue around. It's a big responsibility, and who's going to take this on? But loads of people are wanting to do that, are wanting to engage and put something back into their community, and want to involve themselves in this sort of work. And it is quite humbling to see all these thousands of volunteers across the country. They're not doing it under duress because of cuts. They're doing it because they actually see a new model of delivery to put something back into their community. They find it very satisfying and fulfilling. And actually the outcomes in terms of the service that's delivered is often on par or better than what was had before. So I'm very optimistic about what actually happens. Of course, it's not the same everywhere. And I think you either take the view that unless you can roll out a universal, homogenous service, government's failed, or you actually say in the world that we live in today, you need to look at different models and look creatively at how they can best be worked out in different communities. And I think that's what we're seeing, and I think that's to be welcome.
I'll just make 2 points. So we at Power to Change run a peer network of community-run libraries. So we'd be, as you go forward with your plans, and there are local people who want to find out what's going on in different parts of the country, then we can connect you up with that network. So it's a way of kind of keeping live the best practice. In terms of local leaders, I mean, our experience across community-run businesses is that there's about 7,000 in the country. There are 200,000 volunteers running a lot of those organisations. Our experience is there are leaders in every community who are willing to step up, and actually it isn't always older people. We found a lot of appetite among parents of young children. I've got a 1-year-old. I've never been to my library more than in the last 17 months. So and where you can engage, where the issues are particularly live to young people, you get a lot of engagement from young people. So the leadership comes from all kinds of parts of the community in our experience. And I think every community does have leaders, and that what we've seen is that it doesn't take just one person to make these things work. It takes a collection of local people who come together. So I think we should be quite optimistic about the ability to find people willing to take this responsibility on.
So there's a stat that really bugs me at the moment, and the stat is that 63% of Suffolk's children are registered users of libraries. And what bugs me about that is, even with my mathematics, that means there's an awful lot of children in Suffolk who don't go near a library. So I'm really focused on that at the moment, and I think literature and literacy comes from, we run a summer reading competition. I go and give out the ribbons in my local library, and it comes because we've recommended books. We've created a chart where they start this book, then they go through that, and then they get a certificate through the course of the summer. But it's really important. I mean, what you know is if you can get to the stage where there's a 5 or 6 year old entering your school system and a book can hold their attention, that you can track that to their attainment at GCSEs, they're going on to higher education, their universities and their degree courses. You can track all that. So it's really, really important. And the single task I have tasked my officers with is if there are 63% of children who are using libraries, what about the other ones? Sort it out. And there's real issues there around how you actually drive that forward. And that, to some degree, I think is where local authorities come in, because idiots like me can say I'm not happy and go out and do something and push my officers to go and change things. So we're looking at children's centres, we're looking at how we engage with those families who generally don't engage, and how we can use books and libraries as part of that mix. I think that's really important. I'll give you my card afterwards. I'm the LGA National, one of the peers. So I can arrange for people to come down and see you, or if you want to come up to Suffolk and have a look at what we're doing, absolutely delighted to do that. The magic ingredient as to what makes a volunteer. There isn't a magic ingredient. I think what it is about giving people lots of different opportunities to get involved, and you will find some who are really passionate about libraries, some are really passionate about something else, and different people will get involved in different ways. What you've got to do is make it easy for them to access you and to get involved, so that when you do touch them, when they are enabled or emboldened or angry, quite often they're angry about something, you give them the ability to get involved. And I think one of the most important things for me in local government is that we stop being this clipboard culture of going in, we're experts, we'll sort them. No, stop all that and flip it so that you get the communities involved, get them working in different ways, so that you actually make stronger, more resilient communities. That, to me, is the absolute acid test of what a council should be about.
In terms of ensuring that you can benchmark and see where you're going with the core library services that you passionately want to have, my advice is look outside of the public sector. I've been a councillor for 30 years. Most of my time has been devoted to personal social care and long-term social services. And I've always made an effort to look at other local authorities, away from home, long way from home, and also outside of the public service. And we did a very big piece of work on the library in Kensington Chelsea. It was never much good, despite the name, fancy name, but I can assure you, big building, worth a lot of money, but it was never much good. In fact, public libraries in London aren't much good because you've got 32 boroughs, so you haven't got anything like a New York public library at the heart of it. It's just a fact of life. One borough would do arts, another one would do science, some would do history, and they never really had the right concentration. Some of them had some very handsome buildings, like the one in Kensington Chelsea. And what we did is we took advice from librarians working outside the public service. We were strapped for cash like everybody else. We had to make savings. So we went to the librarian at the Reform Club, at the Athenaeum, at the Royal Society. We got the former president of the Royal Society, Bob May, to help us. We got the former rector of Imperial College, Sir Roy Anderson, to help us. And they drew up a list of journals and stuff that they thought should be available, not the kind of stuff you would have in a specialist university reference library, but as Roy Anderson said, if a boy or girl is applying from Holland Park School to do medicine, what advice would I give them? Go to your public library, rake through science and nature over the last 4 months, prepare yourself for the interview. We've just spent over 80 million quid rebuilding Holland Park School, so we wanted to make sure that we had that kind of material in the library. And we didn't actually get it from our own librarians. That advice came from private sector librarians who were on a much tighter budget than we had in the public service. And when we went through their shopping list of about 20, 25 journals that we added both digitally and in open shelf paper terms, the net extra spend was about 12 grand. And I can tell you, as Cabinet Member for Finance at the time, that was the cheapest bit of reorganisation of budgets that one actually did. And it's a great sales technique, and people are in there rifling through them and using them all the time. And it was a revelation to our professional librarians that they were actually wanted. So I would say look outside of the public service, look outside of our own local authority. And I'm going to say something very controversial. You should have the confidence to think about what you think your own local community, particularly the more disadvantaged members of your local community, actually need. I went to university because I had access to Plymouth Public Library. My cousin is a hospital consultant, because having had 4 disastrous interviews at various teaching hospitals, he held his own in a difficult interview at Bart's based on an article in the journal Nature that he'd read in Enfield Public Library. And that is the mission that one should actually have for our very poorest communities. I know one more question sitting there. Go.
Hi, I'm Ed Wallace from Locality. We are a network of community organisations across England. And it seems to me that there are kind of 2 slightly different parts to this conversation. One is about, I suppose, a kind of reactive response to austerity and, you know, the fact that at local government level has been very serious cuts, and councils are struggling to keep services going, therefore you need volunteers, and it's kind of almost like a use it or lose it approach to public service reform. And then the other thing is, I think, and this is what you're talking about, Vidyha, which is, I suppose, a fundamentally different approach to public services, which is trying to get to the bottom of the fact that, you know, we have more complex problems, and we need to kind of reshape things at the local level, and those type of kind of holistic, kind of hub-type approaches, which I think community-run libraries can be, which multi-purpose community organisations provide, does seem to be the way that you can build those relationships, build trust, and get to the bottom of those types of complex problems which both the public and private sector kind of often struggle to grasp with. So I suppose my question is, how do we build that? What support do we need from government in order to do that? And I think the 2 strands that have come out of the conversation around local leadership and community capacity need to go hand in hand, and what can government do to really support that?
Lovely. Another question? Right, away you go. Shall we start with you?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, but I'll give it a go. I think there are two strands, but I think the reality is that the state of local authority finance has created the burning platform that I think we've needed to try and put community-run services back on the map. And I think that I don't hear a conversation purely about reactive, just a reactive approach, which is just about saving what was there in its form. Actually, what I'm hearing is the role of local authorities has fundamentally changed, partly because of finance, but I think partly because of realisation of the problems that communities now face are more complex, and that local authority role is now as a facilitator, enabler, a placemaker, not as a deliverer of services and a doer of everything. And I think that's a real opportunity there to really drive forward more community-run public services and to make them not just a reactive solution, but to make them something that is about embracing innovation, new business models, and better outcomes as a result of doing that. So I think the reality, we are faced with the reality of local authority finance that is pushing in this direction, but I think where we're headed is towards something that isn't just communities taking over and doing what was always done, but actually much more innovation and more interesting solutions than that.
As a constituency MP, I remember when I took office in 2010 and I went to visit the Citizens Advice Bureau, and we moved into a unitary authority in Wiltshire in 2009, and about 5 CABs came into one structure in Wiltshire. And basically they conceded to me that it was working much better. They had a much better arrangement. And I said to them, well, why didn't you do it before then? And he was almost reluctant to admit what he just said, because he was so wedded to standing up for Salisbury CAB. He didn't like to admit that Wiltshire CAB was a better construct. And that is difficult, because actually sometimes if you look at things from first principles about what would be the best way to deliver it, and so in my local authority, actually having 80 different local authority buildings wasn't actually a very good thing. The fact of consolidated down to 9, with hubs providing multiple services in different locations, is actually much better in terms of the efficiency of those services, but also just the ease of access for the members of the community. And I think this in terms of your question, Ed, about what can government do. I mean, really, what government can do is provide the network to take all the learnings from all these different experiences and make sure that they're readily accessible, and that there is a toolkit, and that where possible there will be some limited funds to invest in making some of these transformational investments. But realistically, as I try to explain this paradox of my role as Libraries Minister, local authorities will be taking the lead in making these decisions. I think that most of the time, when they're enlightened and sort of visionary leaders like the other end of the table, they're doing it through actually, that's you, Colin. They're doing that through actually, a sense of, this is what the community need, and they need to be facilitated to achieve what they want, which is more access to libraries, but in a different way, in a different form.
So, a really interesting question, because the words are picked out, reactive. Therefore, you need more volunteers. And you could look at it like that. You could look at it quite flatly like that. So I got involved in politics because I had 2 council tax bills land on my doorstep. One, they put the council tax up by 11.9, and this was a Liberal and Labour coalition. And the following year, they put it up by 18.5. So they put it up by a third, and that's a bill people have to pay. And I thought to myself, that cannot be right. So I got involved, I got elected, and sort of gone through it, and now the leader. And it's certainly true that in 2010, there was a catalyst, the Comprehensive Spending Review. You're going to have a lot less money. What are we going to do about it? So there was a catalyst. So you could take this reactive, therefore, need. But when we came in 2005, we told the officers that next year, we are not putting it up for more than 4.5. And we've got a whole load of balconies, the big atrium. I swear they were threatening to throw themselves off the balconies because they were used to a diet of a lot more money. And we've now just delivered 7 years of zero at the same time as massive cuts. And what we've said to the organisation is it isn't just because there's less money. We want you to behave very differently. We want you to be an organisation that is far more about the community. So I think in some ways it looks like that. You've had less money, so you've changed the way you've operated, therefore you get the word reactive and therefore. Absolutely not. And it is not because I started there as a journey, because you learn, life changes you, every single experience you have, but I'm now absolutely in this space that the way in which we do things needs to be dramatically different. And then I spoke earlier about Suffolk Blueprint, which is a 20-year vision about public health, about public services, and a piece we're trying to get people to buy in as the next steps for why we're changing things, so the rationale for why we're changing things. And it fundamentally is that there is not the money in the system. There will never be the money in the system to handle an ageing population. And an ageing population presents dramatically different issues for society. I'm reading a book at the moment. I thoroughly recommend it to everybody. I say it everywhere I go. It's called The 100-Year Life. It's on Amazon. It's worth Googling. It's worth getting. Because it talks about the fundamental changes that are going to happen when people are living the better part of 40 years longer. And there is a stat that really sticks in my mind. Today, and in the last 3 months, more than 50% of the women born will live to over 100. Now start to think about that in terms of public services. Start to think about that in terms of the way in which communities operate. And you realise there has to be a dramatically different approach to how we do. Things government should and shouldn't do. So much of this is so local, it is ridiculous. You go into one community against that community, their behavioural patterns, who are the community leaders, who you can get involved, are totally different. The notion that government can in any way pull a lever in Westminster that influences that is just not possible. So I think that's absolutely right. Government should be the convener of best practice and all those things, but it has to be at an unbelievably local level, and there's Justin sitting at the back as well, parish councils as well. It has to be really, really at a local level as well.
Now, I was going to say, we've got time for one very quick last question, and I'm also, in the answers, asked the panel to do their final goodbyes and set our caps straight ready on libraries for the future. So there's a question there from that gentleman.
Michael Rarash from the Nile Valley. Thank you very much. I just want to commend you all very much for all you've said. There's an old saying, the person closest to the problem is best able to solve it, as you say, and you've demonstrated that very, very well, sir. And thank you for all the work you're doing. It's absolutely brilliant, and we're out for solving problems. What do they say? The difficult we do at once, the impossible takes a little longer. And I also, without being too political, but I've voted Conservative all my life, I also want to say the private sector is in a culture of creating wealth. And we have to create wealth, and we have to manage things properly. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, first of all, thank you all very much for coming, and I'm going to ask the panel to actually say a few closing words. And shall we just, as we started, we'll work backwards. Sort of that way.
Yep. So I was really pleased to come along today because I think there is a real future for libraries, and I think this point about are they basically going to be book lenders, I'm not that convinced, because I think there are many, many ways. I certainly think for younger children, the point you made about you've never been to the library so much, and I think librarians and volunteers, and when I go to my local library and they've got a Halloween thing on Saturday I'm going to, and you do all these different things, you can see that the notion of them as a community hub, I think, is really important, and how that can then be a catalyst for other things, and literally being part of it. But I think that's the future for libraries, and that's certainly how I'm going to sort of attempt to drive forward the service in my county.
Colin, thank you very much.
Yes, so thank you all for coming, and thanks to Politics Exchange for hosting us. So I think it was an interesting snippet that one of my colleagues sent this morning, which was that from the 1950s to the 1980s, most rural libraries were run by volunteers, and it feels like we're kind of going back to that model. And I'm really enthused by the optimism in the room, really, that this is a viable model and one that has a lot of support, and the leadership of both John and Colin means that this is an agenda that's set to thrive. So that's great.
And thank you so much for supporting us and getting us to do it. We really do appreciate it. Thank you very much. John?
In 1937, my now 96-year-old grandmother worked in Boots Library in Salisbury.
Yes.
With a subscription model with 3 tiers of membership, and she used to have to package up the books for certain very special people when she would select these books. Now, on Saturday, as the Libraries Minister, I went into Manchester Library and I saw the Wolfson room, which was the traditional reading room where people were studying, and it's never been busier, with 340 people in there at capacity most working days. But when I walked around the back, there was somebody playing the piano, and I just thought, gosh, how over those 80 years haven't things changed? You know, as the Libraries Minister, I'm excited about the opportunities that exist to deliver library services and a range of additional services in those library settings in different ways. And I'm not unrealistic about the challenges that exist in some communities, I acknowledge that, but I think that we've got a lot to be positive about, and the experience of the last 5-7 years has shown that actually, despite the tough operating environment for local authorities, a lot has been achieved, and there's more that can be done, and I hope to see more community-run libraries in the years ahead.
John, thank you very much indeed. Thank you all very much for coming. Greatly appreciate you being here. You can't have these events unless people are kind enough to come along and stimulate us with the questions. So thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the panel very much indeed, and I'd like to show our appreciation in the normal way. Thank you very much.